The United States Navy transformed nearly 65,000 individuals, both American and Allied personnel, into skilled naval aviators during the period from 1941 through 1945. However, the remarkable journey of creating these aviation warriors actually commenced in 1935, 6 years before America's entry into the global conflict. The foundation for this massive training endeavor was established long before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor. During 1935, the combined Navy and Marine Corps aviation community possessed fewer than 1,500 aircraft of various types, supported by less than 1,000 pilots, 575 non-pilot officers, and approximately 13,000 enlisted personnel. At this time, Japanese aggression had already terrorized China for 4 years, while German forces had intimidated Europe for 3 years. Recognizing the urgent need for additional pilots, Congress enacted the Aviation Cadet Act, establishing the rank of aviation cadet within both Naval and Marine Corps reserves. This groundbreaking legislation also created a comprehensive pilot training program targeting college graduates between the ages of 18 and 28. The program structure required 1 year of flight instruction, followed by 3 additional years of active duty service. Upon completion, aviation cadets would transition to inactive reserve status as either ensigns or second lieutenants. President Roosevelt issued a call for rebuilding United States military forces in 1938. By this time, naval aviation had expanded to 2,050 aircraft, 1,700 pilots, 600 non-pilot officers, and 20,500 enlisted personnel. During this same period, German forces occupied Austria and the Sudetenland, while additional Chinese territory fell under Japanese control. The Secretary of the Navy appointed the Hepburn Board to conduct a comprehensive survey of the naval aviation shore establishment, acknowledging a critical reality. In the event of war, massive expansion of naval aviation would be absolutely essential. The board's recommendations included enlarging 11 existing air stations and establishing 16 new facilities. The Naval Expansion Act of 1938 authorized 3,000 new aircraft, which would eventually replace the biplane aircraft then operating from fleet carriers with modern Grumman 4F Wildcat fighters, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and other advanced aircraft that would serve the Navy during the early phases of the approaching conflict. Significant revisions to the Aviation Cadet Act occurred in 1938, providing for immediate commissioning of cadets upon completion of training. To accelerate pilot production, the training duration was reduced from 12 months to 6 months, while ground school instruction was shortened from 33 weeks to 18 weeks. Primary training utilized land planes, basic training employed service land planes, and instrument flying became mandatory for all students. Advanced training students could choose specialization in patrol and utility operations, observation duties, or carrier aircraft operations. In September of that year, German and Russian forces dismembered Poland. President Roosevelt declared a state of limited national emergency. Naval aviation, including its marine components, now possessed 2,100 aircraft, 1,800 pilots, 625 non-pilot officers, and 21,000 enlisted personnel. By 1940, naval aviation had approximately 2,100 aircraft and a pilot strength of 2,900. This marked the year when France surrendered to Germany, the British Army evacuated from the European continent, and German forces occupied Denmark, Norway, and the Low Countries. The President called for rapid modernization and expansion of both Army and Navy forces, including production of 50,000 aircraft annually, while the Navy requested $4 billion for a 2-ocean Navy. As the Battle of Britain raged across English skies, Roosevelt and Churchill negotiated an agreement to exchange 50 aging United States destroyers for British naval and airbase locations in the Atlantic. Anticipating naval aviation expansion, the Chief of Naval Operations established the Mason Board to study and recommend measures for pilot training enhancement. Board proposals included enlarging 12 existing Naval Reserve air bases and establishing 8 new facilities. These Naval Reserve air bases, known as E-bases, provided 30 days of elimination training to pilot candidates. Successful candidates proceeded to Pensacola, Florida, or Corpus Christi, Texas, as aviation cadets for an additional 6 months of training before commissioning and squadron assignment. The Naval Reserve Air Bases were destined to become the foundation of the wartime primary training establishment. Although no direct connection existed, it would have been personally meaningful had there been one. The author enlisted in the Naval Reserve on July 22, 1940 pounds. Coincidentally, the same day, Churchill rejected a peace offer that Hitler had made 4 days earlier during a speech to the Reichstag. In mid-August, following orders, the author reported to the battleship Illinois, a relic from Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. This vessel resembled a massive barn-like structure at the edge of the North River in New York City. Within an hour, along with several hundred other college men, the author departed Illinois, received sailors' white uniforms, and embarked for a month-long introduction to Navy operations aboard the battleship Arkansas, then anchored in the river. While performing deck-swabbing duties and learning about battleship operations, Congress passed the first peacetime draft law, selective service, TA, and National Guard units began mobilization. Upon returning to New York after port calls at Guantanamo, Cuba, Panama, and Norfolk, Virginia, civilian clothing was returned, Naval Reserve membership was confirmed, enrollment for a midshipman's school class beginning in June 1941 was completed, and the journey back to college for another term commenced. You're climbing too slowly. Lower that nose. Stop executing flat turns. Do you want to spin us into the ground? Your control movements are jerky. Why don't you display any confidence? These words emanated from a red-faced, lanky instructor commanding a 50-horsepower Piper J3 Cub. The flight instructor's criticism was directed at the student pilot. At 500 feet above the colorful Ohio countryside during autumn 1940, these sharp words caused no distress whatsoever. The student's aspiration was to emulate those aviators observed and envied as they played among the clouds overhead. This compelling desire had existed since age 10, and a $5 5-minute flight in an OX-5-powered Travelair biplane, following the Arkansas cruise. The first step toward achieving this goal involved the Civil Aeronautics Authority Civilian Pilot Training Program, known as CAA-CPT. The President's call to increase the nation's military aircraft production 50-fold generated a national effort to train pilots, with the CAA-CPT serving as a foundation. Launched experimentally at 12 colleges in 1939, 700 schools, including the Authors Institution, participated in the program by the 1940 fall semester. Beyond the fundamental urge to fly, the simple requirements for CPT entry included passing a flight physical examination and providing $20 for insurance, plus $4.50 for textbooks. The elementary CPT course encompassed 35 to 40 hours of primary flight instruction in the Piper Cub at local airports and 72 hours of ground school at participating colleges. Successful completion of a check flight with a CAA inspector at course conclusion earned a private pilot's license. No military obligation was required, though most graduates eventually joined either the Army or Navy. Many female participants became pilots in the Wartime Women Air Force Service Pilots Program. Program requirements were later modified to exclude women and require military obligations. Admiral Yamamoto's pilots thrust America fully into the war with their devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, but that year had been violent from its beginning. The President had declared an unlimited national emergency in May. American Lend-Lease war materials were being shipped to the British, and by fall, Navy ships were escorting convoys to Iceland and Britain. Combat occurred with U-boats, United States ships sustained damage or were sunk, and crewmen perished. Hitler launched a massive assault on Russia across more than 1,800 miles from the Black Sea to the Arctic. Japan occupied much of Southeast Asia and China. Germany controlled the Balkans, Greece, and Crete, and maintained offensive operations in Africa. United States Marines deployed to Greenland, Iceland, and Trinidad. By year's end, Guam and Wake Island had fallen to Japanese forces. In mid-1941, naval aviation possessed 3,400 aircraft, 4,600 pilots, 1,000 non-pilot officers, and 13,700 enlisted personnel. To accelerate pilot production, Navy carrier flight students began specializing in fighter, scout bomber, or torpedo aircraft operations rather than training in all three categories as previously practiced. Student quotas increased from 800 to 2,500 per month, targeting production of 20,000 pilots annually by 1943. All naval reservists were activated on June 12, 1941, coincidentally the same day the author and 499 others were sworn in as midshipmen, V7, aboard Noah's Ark, Prairie State, as Illinois had been renamed. An intensive 24-hour daily boot camp and concentrated academic program resulted in most participants wearing ensign's stripes 97 days later. Orders assigned the author to Elliott, an aging destroyer previously involved in the Destroyers for Bases agreement that had been converted to a high-speed minesweeper. Instructions directed reporting to Naval Air Station, San Pedro, California, to await transportation to wherever Elliott might be located. Scattered fractocumulus clouds dotted the Southern California sky from Dana Point to Malibu as the author flew a rented Aeronca aircraft over the harbors of Long Beach and Los Angeles. During the 2-week wait at San Pedro, the only Navy duty involved daily checks on transportation availability. This provided ample opportunity for flying rented aircraft up and down the coast, but the interlude ended upon becoming junior engineering officer in Elliott's engineering department at Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. Operating with Indianapolis, Hopkins, Southard, Long, and Dorsey, Elliott cruised on one of her 2 engines off Johnston Island on December 7, 1941, when the urgent message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor, this is no drill," was received in the radio compartment. The author was wearing dungarees inside the port condenser attempting to locate a saltwater leak in the ship's freshwater system. Regardless of the leak, the ship went to general quarters, activated both engines, and proceeded at maximum speed back to Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, as the ship approached the harbor entrance, a Douglas SBD Dauntless from Enterprise could be observed in shallow water where it had been shot down by overzealous American personnel. Inside the harbor lay the wreckage of Battleship Row. Some fires continued smoldering. Bunker fuel covered the waters. Most war news during spring 1942 was discouraging. Tokyo propagandists were heard interviewing Wake Island prisoners, with the same actors' voices portraying different prisoners claiming humane treatment. In addition to Wake and Guam, Singapore fell, Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya, the British and Dutch lost other major vessels in the Battle of the Java Sea, Bataan surrendered, and a few American and Filipino survivors maintained positions on Corregidor. In April, one bright development illuminated the gloom. Jimmy Doolittle's 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from Hornet successfully bombed Japan. Damage was minimal, but depressed American morale soared, and Japan withdrew offensive forces for home defense. Lexington was lost in exchange for the Japanese carrier Shoho during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. The heavily damaged Yorktown was rapidly repaired at Pearl Harbor, and along with Enterprise and Hornet, departed toward Midway to alter the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers Kaga, Soryu, Akagi, and Hiryu, along with their experienced air groups, were destroyed in exchange for Yorktown in early June. In August, American forces invaded Guadalcanal. Saratoga's aircraft sank the Japanese carrier Ryujo, while Enterprise and Saratoga sustained damage in separate engagements. The following month, Wasp was sunk by a submarine, and Hornet was lost in the Battle of Santa Cruz. Navy flight training expanded rapidly under Captain Arthur Radford and Commander Austin R.T. Doyle in Washington, both of whom later achieved distinguished admiral rank. Trainees were advanced into flight operations as quickly as new facilities were commissioned. Numbers were limited only by available aircraft and airfields from which to operate. The E-bases were discontinued in February when they became fully occupied with primary students. The draft had recruited so many college men by April that qualifications for enlistment as naval aviation cadets, V5, were reduced from 2 years of college education to a high school diploma. This created bottlenecks in the training system as more bases, training aircraft, and flight instructors were developed to alleviate the congestion. At the time of the Battle of Midway, the Navy and Marine Corps aviation community comprised more than 7,000 aircraft, 11,000 pilots, 7,000 non-pilot officers, and 40,000 enlisted personnel. To maintain the training pipeline, pre-flight training was established at the universities of North Carolina, Iowa, Georgia, and at St. Mary's College and the Del Monte Hotel in California. Navy students at these institutions received approximately 3 months of intensive physical training and Navy indoctrination. From these locations, cadets proceeded to 3 months of primary training and 4 additional months of intermediate training. Most had been exposed to flying light aircraft in the CAA CPT before being called to active duty at the pre-flight schools. Navy flight training operated in this manner during June 1942, but numerous modifications were made to the length and phases of the training program as the war progressed. Supervision transitioned from Washington to 4 newly established functional commands: primary, intermediate, operational, and technical. The first 3 trained aviators, while the latter trained the technicians to maintain them in flight operations. As a diversion during the Midway Campaign, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Dutch Harbour in the Aleutians. Elliot, with the author among her crew, deployed there, but his aspirations remained focused on aviation. A request for transfer into naval aviation was submitted. The Navy's response indicated that the author could relinquish his commission to become a cadet or wait until completing 1 year aboard Elliot and then apply for training in current grade as a lighter-than-air pilot. Shortly thereafter, an ALNAV message arrived announcing opportunities for heavier-than-air craft training after 1 year at sea. Prospects were improving. That ALNAV was followed by another announcing that, to meet urgent requirements for pilots, junior reserve officers holding pilot certificates could request Navy flight training but would serve as instructors before squadron assignment. Requests were submitted for consideration under both ALNAVs. Meanwhile, operations continued in Aleutian fog, storms, and cold conditions. The ship narrowly avoided a torpedo from submarine RO-60-1, later sunk by Reed, and was protected by Nashville's guns off Kiska when Japanese shore battery fire became uncomfortably accurate. Coveted orders for naval aviation entry arrived in January 1943. The troop transport Wartime delivered the author from Kodiak, Alaska, to Seattle, Washington, during the city's heaviest snowstorm in 25 years. After leaving California, the train arrived at a grimy station in Chicago on a day colder than the one left in Kodiak. The cross-country train journey was memorably highlighted by ladies in Grand Island, Nebraska, who braved a blizzard to serve coffee, cake, and pie to uniformed personnel on the train. After checking in with the Chicago Naval Aviation Cadet Selection Board, responsible for processing flight candidates, local transportation conveyed the author to the Lewis School of Aeronautics at Lockport to begin training, which resulted in Navy wings being awarded some 9 months and 350 flight hours later. New minesweepers, destroyer escorts, and landing craft moving down the nearby Chicago Sanitary Canal from Great Lakes construction yards served as daily reminders of the ongoing war. Otherwise, the conflict seemed distant. The pilot training program underwent another modification in January 1943. Flight preparatory schools opened at 20 colleges and universities where cadets began training with 3 months of academic work, then proceeded for 2 months of elementary flight and ground instruction under civilian contractors at War Training Service schools, as the Civil Aeronautics Authority Civilian Pilot Training Program had been renamed. They continued at pre-flight schools for 3 months before advancing to primary training. The Great Lakes steamer Wolverine had been commissioned the previous August, and sister ship Sable in May 1943, to provide flight decks in submarine-free Lake Michigan for carrier training of pilots and deck crews. By this time, naval aviation possessed more than 17,000 aircraft, 26,600 pilots, 23,300 non-pilot officers, and 156,000 enlisted personnel. On other war fronts, new Essex-class carriers were experiencing combat in 1943, and the Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered operational service. Germans had surrendered at Stalingrad. 2 assassination attempts by German officers against Hitler failed. Japanese resistance ended on Guadalcanal, and Admiral Yamamoto was shot down. Italy was invaded by Allied forces, and the Italians surrendered and declared war on their former Axis partners. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Tehran and agreed that the invasion of France would receive first American and British priority. At the end of 1943, The Naval Air Training Command, under the Chief of Naval Operations, was established with headquarters at Pensacola, Florida, to direct all naval aviation training of the primary, intermediate, and operational air training commands. At this point in the war, naval aviation cadets had completed almost 1 year of training before reaching primary instruction. During the first 4 months, a prospective cadet, as a seaman tarmac, performed apprentice duties at an air station, theoretically to establish emotional bonds with naval aviation and practically to make him unavailable for the draft. Upon gaining cadet status, he proceeded to a flight preparatory school at one of 17 colleges for 3 months of military indoctrination, physical training, mathematics, physics, basic navigation, and aircraft and ship recognition. Next came 8 to 12 weeks at one of the 92 colleges and civilian flight operators with CAA WTS schools, providing 35 to 40 hours of flight instruction in light aircraft. Most unsuitable candidates were eliminated here. The remainder received 3 months of physical training at the North Carolina, Iowa, Georgia, or California pre-flight schools. Primary training followed, consisting of 11 to 14 weeks and 90 to 100 flight hours, usually in a Boeing N-2S Stearman, officially designated the cadet. Precision flight techniques were instilled for the necessary transition to heavier and more powerful operational aircraft. After mastering basic aircraft handling in primary, students advanced to 14 to 18 weeks and 160 additional flight hours in intermediate training at Pensacola or Corpus Christi, Texas. Experience in higher horsepower trainers and instrument flight preceded specialization in carrier, multi-engine sea or land, or observation-type aircraft designated respectively CV, VPB or VB2, or VO, VCS. Intermediate trainers included the Vultee SNV Valiant, commonly called Vibrator, North American SNJ Texan, Consolidated PBY Catalina, Beech SNB Kansan, and Vought OS-2U Kingfisher. Prior to graduation and commissioning, students selected as carrier pilots flew the SNJ while specializing in tactics for fighters, designated VF, torpedo bombers, VTB, or scout, dive bombers, VSB. Assignment of new pilots to squadron types was based on needs of the service, as well as individual preference, with significantly more weight given to the former consideration. Following intermediate training came 2 months of operational training at one of 17 naval air stations along the Florida, Georgia, and Carolina coasts to provide new naval aviators with a 100-hour introduction to combat-type aircraft as weapons systems. Among operational aircraft were the Grumman 4F, or General Motors FM2, Wildcat, Grumman F6F Hellcat, Vought 4U, or Goodyear FG, Corsair, Douglas SBD Dauntless, Grumman TBF, or General Motors TBM, Avenger, Curtiss SB2, C Helldiver, Lockheed PV Ventura, Consolidated PBY Catalina, and Martin PBM Mariner. Those destined for carrier assignment qualified aboard Wolverine or Sable, although a few utilized the escort carrier Charger in the Norfolk, Virginia area. From this point, assignment to a squadron followed, where training remained a constant activity. An unforgivable transgression in Navy flying then, as now, was showboating. Low-altitude buzzing over residential areas or exuberant low passes down highways constituted serious violations. Enthusiastic pilots enjoyed being observed and believed themselves appreciated by the civilian population. Those foolish enough to make a second pass frequently found themselves facing disciplinary action. Those with extremely poor judgment became fatalities after encounters with unseen wires, trees, and canyon walls. In an attempt to control such behavior, some air stations published newspaper stories requesting citizens to report the time, place, and identification numbers of any sighting where the aircraft's large identification numbers could be read. While this system may not have eliminated all violations, it definitely reduced repeat offenses. Vineyards covered much of the land near one California base. Sheep grazed on nearby hillsides where some pilots occasionally buzzed the animals. One aviator with peculiar humor forced 1,000 personnel at another base to take cover during a Saturday morning inspection. A court-martial sentenced this individual to spend the remainder of the war contemplating his poor judgment with a mop rather than aircraft controls in his hands. Many farmers and ranchers accepted property damage by aircraft as their contribution to the war effort. Aviators not on immediate flight schedules were sometimes assigned by the station's legal department to make public relations visits to affected parties, who were asked to sign conditional damage releases. The author's destination on one such assignment was the Concannon Winery in the Livermore, California, valley where a fatal crash had damaged rows of valuable vines. The lane wound through the vineyard to an old California-style house. A servant answered the door and escorted the visitor into the home's cool interior. There he was received by a paternal gentleman, Joseph Concannon, son of the vineyard's founder, who inquired about his knowledge of wine. When informed of complete ignorance regarding wine, he suggested sampling his product. Cheese, crackers, and several varieties of delicious white wine were presented. While sampling, the vintner explained the varieties of grapes used in wine production. The grape's history and the manufacturing process proved fascinating, as did the taste. Only when this pleasant activity reached its natural conclusion did Mr. Concannon ask, "Now, son, where is that document you want me to sign? We lost a few vines." "They can be replaced, but those 2 young men killed in that crash can never be." The author departed with a signed document and warm feelings that persist to this day for Mr. Concannon and his craft. Information regarding the numbers of training accidents compared to those in the fleet is unavailable, though there were probably more of the former. Overall, Navy flight statistics for 1945 are available, and the numbers are impressive. That year, 15.5 million hours were flown. More than 13,000 major accidents occurred, half resulted in destroyed aircraft. The more than 3,000 fatalities occurred at a rate of 20.5 per 100,000 hours flown. Current statistics demonstrate Navy flying as being much safer. In the 2,238,777 flight hours in 1989, there were 55 Class A accidents involving fatalities or damage of at least $1 million, with 54 aircraft lost and 78 fatalities, a rate of only 2.46 per 100,000 hours. Flight students lived in barracks and followed strict regulations, which read in part, "Cadets are to form details and return to barracks following noon meal. It is mandatory that cadets organize in details of 4 men or more. Cadets are required to attend all formations for meal periods. They must be in full uniform and will be marched to the mess hall at all times. Caps removed in cadet regiment. Hands out of pockets at all times. Cadets are urged to attend divine service held in the chapel each Sunday, 06:30 and 08:30 Roman Catholic Mass, 10:00 Protestant divine services. Cadets are required to maintain regulation haircuts. Cadets will use the barbershop supplied by ship's service. Numerous other regulations existed. The otherwise well-disciplined life of flight students was occasionally interrupted by juvenile pranks. One individual followed a regular evening routine, a pre-taps shower followed by a naked run through the barracks while screaming the Tarzan call. Reaching his upper bunk, he would swing from a convenient pipe into his sleeping area. One evening during the shower phase, his barracks mates replaced the bed springs with light twine, warned the occupant of the lower bunk, and waited. Right on schedule came the naked dash, the Tarzan yell, the swing into the sleeping area, and crash. Some pleasures were simple then. Women appointed for volunteer emergency service, designated waves, served on most training bases in nearly every type of non-flying position. They performed their duties as effectively as male personnel. Waves also served on the Stearman flight line. That aircraft's engine was started by cranking an inertia starter by a person standing on a wing, positioning the cranker's posterior directly toward the instructor and student. This fact seldom went unnoticed when the cranker was female. Many romances were observed to develop on the flight line. Starting procedure required the fuel valve to be activated and the engine primed. When the cranker's muscles accelerated the starter to proper speed, the crank handle was removed, ignition was activated, and the starter engaged. If the engine failed to start immediately, the probable cause was a cockpit error. Such problems were minimized by requiring the offending cadet to crank during the next start attempt. The Marshall Islands were occupied with support from 6 heavy and 6 light carriers in 1944. Carrier strikes against Japanese-held islands intensified, and Navy planners established total pilot output targets for 1944, 1945, and 1946 as 20,000, 15,000, and 10,000 respectively. The Chief of Naval Operations issued plans for drastic reductions in pilot training. Some students in pre-flight and earlier training stages were to be transferred to other duties. Sufficient numbers were retained to maintain a pre-flight course expanded to 25 weeks. So-called deselection and voluntary withdrawal from flight training began in June, the month of the Normandy landings in Europe and the beginning of the Mariana Islands campaign in the Pacific. These reductions ended the CAA WTS and flight preparatory school phases of pilot training and resulted in the release of numerous training stations in September. Before these changes began, the Naval Air Primary Training Command consisted of naval air stations at Bunker Hill, Indiana, Dallas, Texas, Glenview, Illinois, Grosse Isle, Michigan, Hutchinson and Olathe, Kansas, Livermore, California, Memphis, Tennessee, Minneapolis, Minnesota, New Orleans, Louisiana, Instructors School, Norman, Oklahoma, Ottumwa, Iowa, and St. Precincts, Louis, Missouri. Total aircraft numbered almost 3,600 and personnel, including students, 46,700. Simultaneously, the Naval Air Intermediate Command included the Naval Air Training Centers at Pensacola and Corpus Christi, as well as the Instrument Instructors School at NAS Atlanta, Georgia. The Pensacola Center included Naval Auxiliary Air Stations Barrin, Bronson, Corry, Ellison, Sofley, and Whiting Fields. The center at Corpus Christi consisted of Naval Auxiliary Air Stations Cabanis, Chase, Cudahy, Kingsville, Rodd, and Waldron Fields. Command aircraft numbered 4,200 and personnel, including students, almost 73,000. The Naval Air Operational Training Command in March 1944 comprised Naval Air Stations Banana River, Daytona Beach, DeLand and Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Beaufort, South Carolina, Naval Auxiliary Air Station Cecil Field, Florida, Marine Corps Air Station, Edenton, North Carolina, and the Carrier Qualification Unit at NAS Glenview, Illinois. Also in the command, Naval Auxiliary Air Station Green Cove Springs, Florida, Naval Air Stations Jacksonville, Melbourne, Miami, Sanford, and Vero Beach, Florida, and St. Simon's Island, Georgia, Radar School. Other stations included the Naval Air Navigation School, Shawnee, Oklahoma, and Naval Auxiliary Air Station Mayport, Florida. Command aircraft numbered more than 2,900, personnel almost 54,500. More than 48,000 pilots were assigned to naval aviation roles in 1944, along with 31,000 non-pilot officers and 275,000 enlisted personnel. Reassignment of missions for numerous training bases in 1944 should have indicated that pilot requirements were diminishing. Those instructing in the system failed to recognize the signs. Perhaps this could be excused. Fighting in Europe and the Pacific was at its most intense. Japanese resistance on Iwo Jima was crushed by Marines in March 1945. American fighter aircraft operated from airfields in Japan's vicinity. High-speed carrier task forces operated with impunity. The Philippines were under American control. Boeing B-29 superfortresses were destroying Japanese cities, and the invasion of Okinawa had commenced. In Europe, United States Army troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen into Hitler's disintegrating Third Reich. Naval aviation now possessed 41,000 aircraft, 60,000 pilots, 33,000 non-pilot officers, and almost 338,000 enlisted personnel. Attrition among Navy flight students had been increasing by design for 1 year. With the war's end in sight, cadet elimination rates increased. Granting of extra instructional time to those who failed check flights was severely restricted. Extra instruction to correct flight deficiencies had been routine practice. No longer. Circumstances had changed dramatically. Many who previously would have succeeded did not. Flight or ground school performance, psychological or medical unfitness, or numerous other reasons caused eliminations. Before dismissal occurred, Each individual's record was reviewed by a board of senior officers whose recommendations were usually approved. Those eliminated, depending on their background, proceeded to officer or aircrew training. The few who had held ratings or rank before becoming cadets normally returned to their former status. Events continued to affect flight instructors like the author. In early May, the base shifted to a work schedule of 6 days on with Sundays off, rather than the more demanding 10 days working and 2 days off. On May 7, 1945, Germans surrendered to General Eisenhower at Reims. VE Day was observed the following morning by the executive officer reading an expression of gratitude from national leaders for victory and determination to quickly defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. The author flew as usual with cadets that day, but within 1 week received orders to a refresher course to prepare for fleet return. The refresher proved to be a holding pattern until it became clear whether individuals like the author would be needed against Japan. Replacement pilots on hold were experienced, young, and eager. Not until years later, when top-secret war plans were declassified, was the holding pattern understood. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had plans for the invasion of Kyushu on November 1, 1945, and 4 months later the Tokyo Plain. Some 2,700 ships, more than 100 of them carriers, would participate. By this time, most realized the war was approaching its end. Hiroshima was destroyed by the atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, dropped from the B-29 Enola Gay, flown by Colonel Paul Tibbets, the same individual with whom the author had traveled in 1944 when returning from Instrument Instructors School at Atlanta. The bomb struck Nagasaki August 9, most hostilities ceased August 14, and the surrender was signed aboard Missouri September 2. World War II had ended. Demobilization proceeded rapidly. Within a few months, most naval aviators returned to civilian life. Some remained in the Navy, and many joined the Naval Air Reserve. During the Korean War that occurred 5 years later, fleet carrier air groups, by June 1951, discovered that every third airstrike against communist forces was flown by a reservist. Princeton, Boxer, and Bonhomme Richard operated with air groups of 50, 90, and 100% reservists, respectively. But that represents another story. This narrative concludes here. The mythology of World War II aviation contains tales of aircraft that were designed and developed by inspired contractors during times of great peril and rushed into production and combat to meet dire needs. In contrast, the Navy fought World War II almost entirely with aircraft designs that predated the war's outbreak. Only the Curtiss SC, a battleship and cruiser scout, was initiated after December 1941. 2 aircraft, the TBF, TBM, and F-6F, were begun between September 1939 and December 1941. Both proved vitally important. 3 designs were more than 10 years old by 1945. The Curtiss SOC and Consolidated PBY, initiated in 1933, and the SBD in 1934. Their age emphasizes that aircraft development was complex and time-consuming. The Navy strove to obtain airplanes that best served its requirements. In doing so, its development processes combined astute analysis and skilled design enhanced by trial and error as it determined aircraft types, characteristics for each, and the most useful designs and models. Captain S.U. Ramsdell's articles in this series pointed out that the Bureau of Aeronautics and its field activities provided the Navy with aircraft and aeronautical equipment. The Bureau of Aeronautics Material Division, comparable to today's Naval Air Systems Command, was responsible for aircraft design, development, and production. Guidance on types and characteristics was provided by other Bureau divisions and the fleet. Key Material Division staff members possessed aviation experience dating back to World War I in developing special technologies necessary to take airplanes to sea. Professionally, the staff included both line and engineering specialty officers, aeronautical engineering duty officers after 1935, before then, naval constructors and engineers, and civilian engineers and draftsmen. Experimentation was centered at the Naval Aircraft Factory built during World War I at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, Pennsylvania. The factory designation became misleading during the Republican administrations of the 20s. However, the Naval Aircraft Factory designed and built some experimental aircraft. Its developmental capabilities increased as laboratory facilities were established in such fields as metallurgy, structures, instruments, and others. In 1923, the Aeronautical Engine Laboratory was relocated to the Naval Aircraft Factory from the Washington Navy Yard in District of Columbia. In 1933, a naval flight surgeon was assigned to the Naval Aircraft Factory, beginning a physiological laboratory. In 1937, the ship's experimental unit was transferred from Norfolk, Virginia, where it had pioneered arresting gear development. Other major technological facilities existed. Navy wind tunnels were an adjunct to the model basin at the Washington Navy Yard. In 1936, construction of a new model basin with wind tunnels began at Card Rock, Maryland, northwest of Washington, District of Columbia. Navy flight testing was conducted at naval air stations, usually NAS Anacostia, also in District of Columbia. At the close of World War I, aircraft radio development was handled by a radio laboratory at NAS Anacostia. When the Naval Research Laboratory was established nearby in 1923, the radio laboratory became part of it. Ordnance installations were usually tested at the Naval Proving Ground, Dahlgren, Virginia. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the forerunner of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was responsible for aeronautical research. It had been created by public law in 1914 to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight with a view to their practical solution. Its governing committee included 2 Navy members from the Bureau of Aeronautics. Additionally, Rear Admiral David W. Taylor, who retired from the Navy after World War I, served as a public member until 1938. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Research Laboratory on the lower Chesapeake Bay contained wind tunnels, a towing basin opened in 1931, and other special facilities. During the interwar period, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics headquarters was located in the Navy Department, convenient to the Bureau of Aeronautics. This co-location facilitated exchange of views between the Bureau of Aeronautics and National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics staffs, and undoubtedly brought synergism to the technical expertise of both organizations. 2. Episodes from the Bureau of Aeronautics' early days illustrate some of the complexity in aircraft development. The Bureau selected a new training plane based on fly before you buy tests of 3 competing designs. Aviators at Pensacola, Florida, who would be responsible for its use, conducted the test flying. After the Bureau purchased 50 Boeing NB airplanes based on their findings, they were discovered to be susceptible to flat spins and unsuited for inexperienced pilots. More effective control of aircraft design and testing was needed. The DT-1, the Navy's first carrier-worthy torpedo plane, was at the other extreme. When it was developed, Commander Jerome C. Hunsaker was head of airplane design. He later recalled that Donald Douglas consulted with pilots and engineers and considered their views in making the design. The downside, as Hunsaker pointed out, was that if the episode had become public, the Bureau would have been vulnerable to charges of extreme favoritism. The Bureau needed a better method of acquainting industry on a broad basis with Navy thinking about airplanes. The Bureau, as part of the process of defining needed aircraft types, was already using its drafting rooms to make design studies, including 3-view drawings, performance calculations, and, sometimes, wind tunnel data. After basic decisions were made, the Bureau began sending the drawings and data to industry as part of informal design competitions. Thus, companies could either propose their own designs or develop an airplane based on the Bureau design. After they responded, the Bureau evaluated their proposals, usually selected one or more for development, and issued contracts for complete design data and prototype airplanes. Later, the Bureau stopped including 3-view drawings in the design competition package. Losers sometimes complained that they were not chosen because they had not slavishly followed the preferences of the Bureau's designers. Eliminating the drawings not only freed the Bureau from that charge, but also eliminated any tendency among company designers to copy a Bureau design rather than use it as guidance in thinking creatively about the Navy's problems. To obtain improved models of an existing design, a product improvement, or evolutionary path was followed. New engine, changes to armament, improved structure, changes requested by squadrons, and others. For example, the 1934 XBT-1 through product improvement became the SBD that in -5 and -6 configurations served as a first-line dive bomber into 1944 and in less demanding roles for the duration. In contrast, the TBD-1, developed the same year, received only minimal improvements and was in production for only 2 years. Thus, it was outdated by December 1941 and was replaced in mid-1942 as soon as the vastly superior TBF became available. Product improvement was important in aircraft designs that remained in production over a period of years. The remainder of this article will survey progress in some key areas: power plants, radio, shipboard equipment, and targets and guided missiles. It will conclude with a look at aircraft development of the 4 major World War II combat types: patrol planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. From this, it is hoped that the reader will gain appreciation of the manner in which the Navy utilized America's engineering and innovative skills on the eve of World War II. Power plants. The airplane's engine is as important as its wing and is less appreciated. One pioneer airplane designer emphasized this by asking, "Who knows the name of Paul Revere's horse?" Many fundamental changes affecting World War II engines were begun in the 20s and early 30s. First, the Navy decided to rely almost exclusively on radial air-cooled engines, beginning with the Lawrence 200 horsepower radial engine developed immediately after World War I. Second, in 1925, Pratt & Whitney Aircraft became a rival to Wright Aeronautical Corporation, which had taken over the Lawrence design. Subsequently, both firms competed in developing engines of approximately the same size and power. Third, around 1930, airplane designers began using circular engine cowlings, particularly the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics cowling, to minimize the drag stemming from the radial engine's large frontal area. Fourth, designers of larger engines began arranging the cylinders in 2 rows to diminish frontal area. Pratt & Whitney began this in 1929. An experimental engine followed in 1930, one with the R1830 widely used during World War II. Fifth, use of radial engines necessitated that the Navy stress anti-knock qualities in fuel. Navy squadrons, as early as 1926, began mixing tetraethyl lead with their gasoline while refueling. An essential element of engine development was running an engine until it failed, redesigning the weakest part, and running it some more. The Aeronautical Engine Laboratory, along with other laboratories, engaged in such tests. Spark plugs, ignition wires, bearings, cooling fins, valves, cams, and other components were tested and improved. An emergency occurred in 1937 when new fighters and dive bombers began experiencing failure of the main crankshaft bearing during high-speed dives. This problem, which threatened a generation of high-performance airplanes, was corrected by developing silver-lead indium bearing material. Overall, during the interwar period, these various efforts resulted in a 5-fold increase in engine power, as well as greater fuel efficiency and longer engine life. At the close of World War I, most airplane engines were rated about 400 horsepower. By contrast, the R2000, 800 and R3000, 350, both begun in 1936, were rated over 2,000 horsepower. Radio and radar. During World War II, no field was more crucial than radio and radar. A major step in improving radio performance in 1929 was a general shielding conference. Practical methods of shielding aircraft radio from stray electric currents were identified, and shielding requirements were incorporated in the 1932 General Airplane Specification. Navy engineers were deeply involved in studying high-frequency radio waves and developing high-frequency equipment. The GFRU transmitter and receiver, the first effective radio for single-seat aircraft, was installed in fighters from the early 30s through World War II. The Naval Research Laboratory developed the IFF Mark I aircraft identification system in 1935 through 1937. The aircraft carrier Ranger tested it in 1938, and it went into service in 1939. A rotating beacon homing system with sector identification was developed and tested in the same time frame and replaced an earlier system in which airplanes were fitted with cumbersome loop antennas. Beginning in 1936, the Bureau of Standards developed a radiosonde, a small radio transmitter attached to weather instruments, and a balloon for use in measuring and reporting pressure, temperature, and humidity at altitude, and transmitting that information to a surface station. By the end of 1938, these were coming into use by ships and shore stations. Naval Research Laboratory's radar development began in 1930 after a stray aircraft reflected the radio signal during tests of a homing beacon. In 1934, the project was redirected from continuous waves to pulse. As experimental designs met their main objectives, a shipboard set was tested aboard the destroyer Leary in 1937. The XAF intended to operate aboard major ships was designed in 1938. Following its test on board the battleship New York, Rear Admiral Alfred W. Johnson, commander of the Neutrality Patrol, described it as one of the most important military developments since the advent of radio itself. Ship-related devices, carriers and helicopters dominate modern naval aviation, but during the interwar years, many methods of taking airplanes to sea were investigated. Catapults for launching aircraft from battleships and cruisers were developed by the mid-20s. In 1938, towed nets were devised that permitted these ships to recover float planes while underway. In 1926, an aircraft operated from a submarine, and in 1940 from a destroyer. For lighter-than-air use, small aircraft, equipped with an overhead hook, flew from and returned to a trapeze on the Navy's last rigid airships. During World War II, Marines would experiment with a similar device, the Brody gear, to operate a spotting plane from an LST, tank landing ship. An Autogiro, with free-wheeling rotor, landed aboard the carrier Langley in 1931. An interesting experiment was the bow arresting gear first installed on Ranger and tested in 1934. Bow gear was installed on the later pre-war and early Essex-class carriers. The earliest carrier catapults were designed to launch seaplanes, but a wheeled airplane was catapulted from Langley in 1929. Serious development of the flush-deck, compressed-air catapult was begun at the Naval Aircraft Factory in 1934. Initially, these were installed on the flight deck and athwartships on the hangar deck of later pre-war carriers. Hangar deck catapults were also originally planned for the Essex-class carriers. The Bureau of Aeronautics hoped to increase flying boat loading by catapulting, and in the late 1930s the Naval Aircraft Factory began developing a 30-ton catapult, so designed that two in parallel could launch a 60-ton flying boat. This was abandoned after a liquid rocket-assisted takeoff project was assigned in May 1941 to the Engineering Experimental Station at Annapolis, Maryland. Patrol planes today. The pre-war emphasis upon flying boat patrol planes seems an anomaly. Through World War II, they played a major role. Before the war, the Navy operated water-based aircraft and left large land planes to the Army. Any views to the contrary were lost in the complex thicket of Army-Navy relationships. Moreover, the 1930s was the decade of the flying boat. A new era in research and development appeared imminent when the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics opened its towing basin in 1931. Flying boats pioneered many transoceanic air routes. For example, in 1935, Pan American's China Clipper inaugurated San Francisco to Manila service. Despite such promise, the 1933 PBY, originally designed as the XP-3Y1, rather than a larger craft with longer range, higher speed, and greater carrying capacity, was the most widely used World War II patrol plane. The Navy sponsored at least 6 distinct flying boat designs as follow-ons to the PBY. A twin-float patrol torpedo bomber was at one extreme, and the flying boat designed for catapulting was at the other. Major efforts went into more conventional large boats, some with 2 and others with 4 engines. Out of these efforts came the Martin PBM and the consolidated PB-2Y. Both entered limited service in 1940. In late 1939, when the Navy needed to order a tested patrol plane for the Neutrality Patrol, the PBY had no competition. Dive bombers and fighters dive bombing was developed by Navy fighter squadrons and shown to be effective against ships in 1926. Since a bomb sometimes struck the propeller or lodged in the landing gear of the releasing plane, The tactic was in jeopardy until 1931 when displacing gear, or bomb yoke, was developed which swung the bomb clear. For several years there was much overlapping among fighters, dive bombers and scouts. Some clarification took place in mid-decade. In 1934, the Bureau of Aeronautics held design competitions for both heavy 1,000-pound and light 500-pound dive bombers, and in 1935 for a single-place fighter. 2 aircraft were selected for development from each, and 5 of the 6 resulting designs were used at least briefly during World War II. The most important were the SBD dive bomber and the 4F fighter. The Douglas SBD was a product improvement development of the Northrop XBT-1. Northrop, in 1934, a subsidiary of Douglas, proposed one design as meeting requirements for both heavy and light dive bombers. The Bureau selected it for development as a heavy dive bomber and procured it as the BT-1. The last airplane was updated and designated XBT-2. By the time the BT-2 was ready for production, Douglas had absorbed its subsidiary and the plane became the SBD-1. The Bureau held another dive bomber competition in 1938, from which it chose the Brewster XSB-2A1 and the Curtiss XSB-2C1. Development contracts were issued in the spring of 1939. The next year, after the fall of France, both were rushed into production before their first flights. With both, production problems compounded development problems. The SB-2A was eventually used briefly as a training plane. The SB-2C entered combat in November 1943 and served as the Navy's chief dive bomber during the last year and a half of the war. The 1935 fighter design competition winners were the Brewster XF-2A1 monoplane and the Grumman XF-4F1 biplane. Grumman decided its design was outmoded and in mid-1936 substituted the monoplane XF-4F2. During 1938 tests of these planes, the Navy was vying with the Army for the first 300 mph fighter, and its new planes missed by about 7%. National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics full-scale wind tunnel tests of the Times fighter XF-2A1 provided a basis for cleaning it up so that it reached 300 mph. Tests of the XF-4F2 were equally successful. Full-scale wind tunnel tests were then used to improve many World War II aircraft. In mid-1938, the Bureau chose to procure the F-2A1. Grumman redesigned the XF-4F2 into the XF-4F3, increasing wing area and installing a more powerful 2-stage supercharged engine. The 4F3 went into service in December 1940. By 1937, fighter designers faced serious problems since multi-engine bombers were approaching the speed of fighters. The Bureau held fighter design competitions in both 1937 and 1938. The first, for twin-engine fighters only, was fruitless. From the next, the Bureau chose to develop 3 widely different designs: the Bell XFL, one with buried liquid-cooled engine, Grumman XF-5F, one with twin air-cooled engines, and Chance Vought XF-4U1 with a single R2800 air-cooled engine and an inverted gull wing. Of the 3 designs resulting from the competition, the most conventional, the XF-4U1, came to meet expectations. According to Vought historians, it reached 400 mph on its first flight in May 1940. The Navy almost immediately placed a production contract: torpedo bombers. There were only 2 design competitions for torpedo bombers during the 30s. One in 1934 produced the Douglas TBD-1 and one in 1939, the Grumman XTBF-1. The Navy obtained 130 TBDs, and production was completed in 1939. The TBF, being 4 years younger and fitted with a more powerful engine, had much better performance. It also carried an additional gun, armor for the pilot and crew, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Before the 1939 design competition, the Bureau investigated glide bombing as an alternative to horizontal bombing. Elimination of the Norden bomb site would have saved space and weight, but that was more than offset, in the eyes of Bureau engineers, by the fact that a stronger and therefore heavier plane would have been required. Unfortunately, there was no data on the relative accuracy of glide bombing and high-altitude horizontal bombing. In conclusion, The foregoing touches many, but by no means all of the areas in which the Navy improved aviation technology during the interwar years and adapted it to taking airplanes to sea. A few of the paths were dead ends. Others appear to have been so, but more study would likely show that they had application in World War II. In some areas, such as rotary wing, it could be argued, but not proven, that greater pre-war effort would have yielded more wartime utility. In retrospect, something should have been done with jet engines, and much more with anti-submarine warfare. Such criticism should not be allowed to obscure basic facts. Overall, the Navy's efforts were successful. Airplanes that were developed and in production by late 1939 replaced earlier biplanes and fended off a thoroughly prepared enemy at the beginning of the war. With additions that were started between late 1939 and late 1941, they provided the wings of victory.